Next up, we have Justin Reale, who's with us at the Corps of Engineers. And he's building, I believe, on the first two, David and Peter's talks, looking at the effects of the Los Conchas fire on water quality and fish assemblages in the Middle Rio Grande.
Thanks, Lynette. And thanks, Dave, for a great introduction. It's not often that we get a nice intro talk, so I appreciate it. A little bit of background first on wildfire. The number of large wildfires greater than 400 hectares has increased in the western U.S. in each of the four previous decades. Often during these large and catastrophic wildfires, you see a reduction in leaf litter and surface vegetation and the development of a hydrophobic layer. And then at precipitation event that occurs within the burn scar, and you get decreased infiltration and increases in overland flow. In 2011, the Los Conchas fire burned approximately 150,000 acres in the Jemez Mountains in north central New Mexico. Approximately 45% of the burn scar was classified as either medium or high severity. And the photo on the upper right is a stand of high burn intensity. Following the onset of the monsoon season in 2011, observations of enhanced erosion, flooding, sedimentation was observed not only in the headwaters within the burn scar, but also on the Rio Grande, as represented on the lower left. This is Cochise Canyon. It discharges into the Rio Grande upstream of Cochise Dam. You can see that there's a lot of movement of sediment and ash into the Rio. And as well as downstream on the Rio Grande below Cochise Dam during the monsoon season. This is probably the one location where you usually see clean water and no turbidity. But after the fire events in 2011, we see it running brown. So that motivated us to evaluate the focus of the study was to leverage long-term high-frequency dissolved oxygen data along with multi-year fish community surveys to evaluate the effects of the Los Conchas fire and subsequent flooding within the Middle Rio Grande. The Los Conchas fire impacted numerous watersheds, both upstream and downstream of Cochise Dam, represented in yellow and green respectively. Upstream of Cochise Dam, the fish community was evaluated using seasonal surveys collected at the Buckman Direct Diversion from July 2010 to July 2014. Those data were collected along 7 predetermined transects, as documented in the photo in the upper right. The surveys were collected via a backpack e-fisher, and effort was documented by the amount of time that the e-fisher was on and in the water. To document the post-fire water quality conditions, we leveraged data from a sonde that was deployed downstream of Cochise Canyon, upstream of Cochise Dam, starting in 2012. Now moving downstream, to evaluate the fish community response, we leveraged data from the Rio Grande Silvery Minnow population monitoring effort, and this site located at the Bernalillo 550 Bridge. Those data are collected monthly between April and October, and a small 2-person seine is pulled through 18 to 20 discrete mesohabitats, less than 15 meters long, and effort is calculated by multiplying the width of the seine by the length of the seine hull. And to evaluate the pre-fire and post-fire water quality conditions, we leverage data from a sonde that has been deployed since 2006, directly downstream of the bridge. Oh, okay. Well, I can tell you about this slide because it's blank. All right, so pre-fire, we okay. So post-fire, the fire occurred in late June 2011. This figure is for July and August, the 2 months immediately following the fire, and we observed in red the frequent and severe geosags, and many of them dropped down to 0 milligrams per liter. In comparison, prior to the Los Conchas fire, using the records from 2007, 8, and 10, we observed geosags that dropped down to about 5.5 milligrams per liter. Now looking at the long-term, the multi-year data sets, hopefully those show up. So the initial sags that I was talking about in the previous slide are right over here. So we see them dropping down to 0 milligrams per liter. This is at Reale. We see those geosags persist for several years following the fire through 2013. The sonde was collecting data upstream of the dam was installed in 2012. And as soon as we put the sonde in the water, we observed geosags that also were down to 0 milligrams per liter. And those persisted also through 2013. So in summary, prior to the Los Conchas fire, DI rarely declined below 6 milligrams per liter upstream of Albuquerque. Immediately following the fire, we observed numerous geosags down to 0 milligrams per liter. And those geosags persisted through 2013, both upstream and downstream of Cochiti Dam. For reference, the no acute lethal concentration for silvery minnow is 4.4, and the LC50 is 0.08 milligrams per liter. And most of the mortality occurs within the first 3 to 8 hours. So now jumping into the second component of the study was to evaluate the fish assemblage response. This is a painful slide, but we need to talk about how the data from each site was analyzed. So we first used a negative binomial models to calculate total and species expected catch per unit effort, or CPUE. Total CPUE, species richness, and Simpson's diversity index were used as assemblage metrics. The density of 3 native cyprinids, fathead minnow, flathead chub, and long-nosed dace, and 1 non-native catastomid or white sucker were used to evaluate the species-specific responses. We use generalized linear mixed models to predict the mean fish assemblage density and diversity during each of the periods of interest. And we also use generalized linear models to evaluate the relationship between fish assemblage density, diversity, to variation in sampling effort, hydrologic conditions, seasonality, the Los Conchas fire, and the 2013 flood event. So what we did is we generated a global model for each parameter and then ranked them, each subset of model combinations ranked by AIC. And then we developed an average model with AIC of 0.9, and then from which we reported significant parameter estimates from this average model. And in the next several slides, those will be represented by a red asterisk. So just a little bit of information on the next couple of slides. The red vertical line represents the onset of those geosags that I showed in the previous slide. The vertical gray line and dashed lines represent the mean and 95% confidence intervals respectively. This figure shows the community or the assemblage response. So for both Buckman and Bernalillo, total fish CPE, species richness, Simpson's index were unaffected by the wildfire. Now moving, which is surprising, given the observations in the geosags, we thought there would be a response. Now moving into the species response post-fire. At Buckman, the fire had a negative impact on fathead minnow. and long-nosed dace, two native species, while other species at Buckman, white sucker, and flathead chub, and then all 4 species of interest at Bernalillo were unaffected by the fire. And then to throw on top of an already stressed community was the September 2013 flood event. 2 dissipating tropical storms dumped 3 to 7 inches of rain within 24 hours, resulting in discharges greater than 225 cubic meters per second, or greater than 8,000 CFS. And not only the flood itself, but also it transported a lot of new sediment, as represented upstream of Conchas, and then the lower right is from the Peralta Canyon, which actually plugged the Rio Grande, pushing the main stem of the river into the Bosque. So unfortunately, the flood event deposited several meters of sediment at the Conchas Water Quality Station, and it actually had to be relocated. So we have a large data gap. But at the Bernalillo site in the lower panel, we observed DO-SAGs between 3 and 4 milligrams per liter during the flood of 2013. So how did the fish assemblage respond to the flood event? At Buckman, total CPE, species richness, and Simpson's index were all negatively impacted, whereas those response variables at Bernalillo were resistant to the flood. Similar to the community response variables, at Buckman, we see a decline in fathead minnow, flathead chub, and long-nosed dace. 2 out of the 3 species were actually not collected until for the remaining 4 surveys through June 2014. And then they collected 1 flathead chub. So there's a drop. And in contrast, we do not see that post-flood response at Bernalillo, and the only species with a significant parameter estimate was white sucker, and we think it's unrelated to the flood. So take-home points: despite post-fire water quality conditions at both sites, assemblage density and diversity were unaffected, with the exception of long-nosed dace and fathead minnow at Buckman. Following the 2013 flood, total density, richness, diversity, and density of native species, including long-nosed dace, fathead minnow, and flathead chub, were negatively impacted at Buckman. And then the fish assemblage density and diversity were unaffected at Bernalillo. And we can attribute that to the variability in the assemblage response. The variability in assemblage responses to differences in proximity and extent of fire impacted contributing watersheds, as well as geomorphology, hydraulic complexity, and species traits. And with that, I do not have time for questions, but I'd like to acknowledge everybody that was instrumental in the data collection and then evaluation of the data. And if you have any questions, chase me down later. Thanks. We do have